Nobody standing in the climate-controlled lobby of Halverson Energy Solutions gave a second look to the man in the faded canvas work jacket who sat in the last row of waiting area chairs, holding a manila folder against his knee like it might blow away. Cole Merritt had signed in at the reception desk 17 minutes earlier, had watched the HR coordinator named Sandra Hatch take one long look at his jacket, his shoes, and the gap in his employment history that stretched back nearly a decade, and had heard her ask, slowly and with the particular kind of patience people reserve for children and individuals they consider beneath them, whether he understood that the facility's technician position required physical labor and overnight hours. Cole had said yes, he understood. He had not said that he also understood the load-bearing tolerances of every switching station in the building's basement, or that he could read the vibration signature coming off the HVAC compressor mounted above the reception desk and tell within 30 seconds that the primary belt was 3 weeks from snapping. He had not said any of those things, because none of them would have helped him in that moment, and Cole Merritt had long since learned the difference between what was true and what was useful to say out loud. What he needed was a night shift job with steady hours and health benefits that would cover his son's follow-up appointments through the spring. That was the entire sum of it. His son's name was Jake, and Jake was 11 years old and had his mother's habit of reading the same paragraph 4 times before turning the page, and his father's stubborn insistence on doing things himself before asking for help. Cole had been raising him alone for 4 years, since Rebecca passed from a blood clot that came without warning on a Wednesday afternoon when Jake was in 3rd grade. And Cole was 43 years old and still believed that the worst thing that had ever happened to him was losing a job. He understood now that he had not known anything about loss at 36. He understood it completely at 47. He thought about Jake's lunch sitting on the kitchen counter, packed the night before with the same care Cole brought to everything he did quietly and without announcement. And he reminded himself that whatever happened in this lobby over the next hour did not matter half as much as what was waiting for him at home. Sandra Hatch had made her opinion of Cole's application clear, without saying it directly, which was its own kind of skill. She had let his folder slip from her hands as she was handing it back, then watched him collect the pages from the floor without offering to help or apologizing for the drop. Cole had gathered each page without rushing, and while he was down there, he had noticed that the floor vent beneath the reception desk was pulling air unevenly on the left side, a sign of partial blockage that, left long enough, would cause the system to compensate by overworking the northeast corner blower. He mentioned it when he stood back up, plainly, and without any expectation that it would impress her. Sandra told him to take a seat in the back row while his file was entered into the system. What happened next was not something she would have predicted. Cole's application was routed through the standard HR pipeline, which processed it automatically and flagged it for supervisor approval, which sent it upward through a chain of digital handoffs until it reached the 31st floor, where the new chief executive of Halverson Energy Solutions, Diana Forsyth, 37 years old, 8 months into a role that had belonged to her father for 30 years, was reviewing a stack of staffing queue approvals between calls. Diana's assistant had learned quickly to bring only the items that required her direct attention. The rest got handled elsewhere. So when the assistant set the single-page application on the desk, with the quiet deliberateness that meant something about it was unusual, Diana looked up. The name in the applicant field was Cole Merritt. Diana did not move for a full 4 seconds. Then she set the page face down on the desk and asked her assistant, in a voice that gave away almost nothing, which position the applicant was seeking. Night shift facilities technician, the assistant said. Diana was quiet for another moment. Then she picked up her phone and called down to the HR floor. She told Sandra Hatch, in language that made the instruction impossible to misinterpret, that Cole Merritt was not to leave the building. Then she said, "Bring him to me, not to HR, straight up here." Across the building on the 28th floor, Neil Caro, Executive Vice President of Operations and the longest-serving member of the company's senior leadership team, was on a call with a vendor when his own assistant knocked and slid a printed message under his hand. He read the name, excused himself from the call in under 10 seconds, and stood very still beside his window for a moment before reaching for his phone. Cole was already in the elevator before Caro had dialed the first number. The 31st floor looked nothing like Cole remembered it. The layout had been reorganized, the old engineering bullpen where he and his team once worked through storm season, replaced by a glass-walled conference suite. The server access points along the north wall had been relocated. The emergency stairwell markers were in different positions. Cole noted each change with the same quiet attention he had given to the floor vent downstairs. Cataloging the layout of a place he had once known the way, a person knows the floor plan of a house they grew up in and were told to leave behind. Diana Forsyth was standing near the window when he was shown in. She was shorter than he expected and younger looking, though her eyes had a kind of focused steadiness that Cole had seen mostly in people who had learned to manage large amounts of uncertainty without letting it show on their face. She was studying him the same way he was studying the room. Neil Caro was also there. Cole recognized him immediately. Caro had aged in the way that certain kinds of men aged when they spent a decade getting everything they wanted. The face softened, but the eyes did not. He told Cole, before Diana could speak, that he was surprised he had the nerve to walk back into this building, and that the legal department would have a different set of opinions about his application than the facilities department did. Cole looked at him for a moment and then looked at Diana. "I came here for a job," he said. Diana set a sealed envelope on the desk between them. Cole recognized his name written on the front in Patrick Forsyth's handwriting, the same deliberate, slightly leftward slant that had signed his original engineering contract years before any of this. She asked him why her father had written, in a separate letter she had found in a locked desk drawer after his death, that this company owed Cole Merritt something it had never paid. Cole looked at the envelope for a long moment and did not ask her to open it. He told her that whatever debt existed between him and her father was old business, and that all he had come for today was a position with steady overnight hours and family health coverage. Diana asked why a systems engineer with his background would apply for a facilities job. Cole told her what was true, that a man's professional record does not recover from being listed as the proximate cause of a regional grid failure, regardless of the underlying facts, and that the market had made its position clear over the course of 10 years. He was not asking for sympathy. He was asking for work. Caro interrupted to remind everyone that the Cascade failure report was on file, that Cole had been found to have deviated from established safety protocols, and that the company had spent considerable resources managing the fallout. Cole did not argue the point. He simply asked whether the original version of that report still existed. Caro said it had been destroyed under standard retention policy. Cole looked at him steadily. "Then you're accusing me," he said, "based on a document that no longer exists." Diana noticed that Caro's answer to that was to change the subject entirely. She gave Cole a 30-day trial under the supervision of Joanne Polk, the facilities manager who had run the maintenance team for 16 years. Caro objected formally and at length, but Diana told him that facilities staff worked under direct supervision and on camera coverage at all times, and that she saw no legal basis for exclusion. She would review the situation at the end of the trial period. Before Cole left the office, he glanced at the building management screen mounted near the door, the one displaying real-time status across all mechanical systems, and mentioned in the same offhand tone he had used about the floor vent that the load differential between the east and west switching stations had been drifting for at least 2 weeks, and that if it continued at the current rate, it would produce a cascade trip within the month. Caro told him he hadn't even picked up a mop yet, and was already performing like an engineer. Cole said a system doesn't care what the person who catches its failure happens to be wearing. He was escorted to the elevator. Diana waited until she heard the doors close. Then she sat back down and opened her father's sealed letter. Joanne Polk had managed the facilities team through 4 ownership transitions, 2 major renovations, 3 different HR directors, and 1 genuinely catastrophic flooding event in the basement server room that she had contained almost entirely through fast thinking and a willingness to wade into knee-deep water at 2 in the morning without being asked. She was not easily impressed, and she was not easily fooled, and within Cole's first 3 shifts she had quietly concluded that he was neither ordinary nor what anyone upstairs appeared to believe. He never complained. He finished the hardest assignments first. He checked equipment that no one had asked him to check, and he was right about it every time. When a junior technician left a pressure valve improperly seated on a secondary coolant line, Cole caught it during a routine walkthrough and corrected it without making the other man feel like an idiot, explaining the fix quietly and completely, the way someone explains a thing they have explained many times before to people they were once paid to teach. Some of the building's office staff had heard, through the particular gravity-defying speed of corporate gossip, that a flagged former employee was now working the maintenance floor, and they treated the information the way certain people treat any social asymmetry they encounter, as an opportunity. Coffee cups were left on freshly wiped surfaces. Wrappers appeared in corners he had just cleared. A few employees took to calling him the engineer with the mop cart, just loudly enough to carry down the hallway. Cole did not respond to any of it. He noted which areas needed extra passes and continued his route. He called Jake every night before his shift started, from the parking garage stairwell, where the signal was clearest. He kept his voice easy, asked about school, about the book Jake was reading, about whether he had remembered to feed the cat. Jake asked once if he liked the new job, and Cole told him he was helping people see things they had missed, which was close enough to the truth to satisfy an 11-year-old without frightening him. Those calls were the fixed point around which the rest of his nights revolved. On the 14th night of his trial period, Cole was performing a standard walkthrough on the lower mechanical level when he found it. A bank of load regulators installed under a vendor registration code belonging to a supplier. Halverson had removed from its approved list 4 years earlier following a parts quality investigation. The units were physically present and functionally active. They were simply not supposed to exist. He also found that the backup switching schematic had been quietly redrawn sometime in the previous 2 years, consolidating 3 formerly independent circuits onto a single shared transfer bus. It was not a mistake a trained systems engineer would make. It was exactly the kind of change that looked like a cost-saving simplification on paper, but created a single point of failure capable of taking down every critical floor in the building simultaneously. Cole reported both findings to the maintenance supervisor on duty, who told him, not unkindly, that he was still in his trial period and might want to focus on the assigned work. Joanne Polk heard about it the following morning and made her own quiet copy of Cole's written notes, without mentioning to anyone that she had done so. That same evening, Diana read her father's letter for the second time, alone in her office after the building had mostly emptied. Patrick Forsyth had not been a man given to emotional writing. The letter was 4 paragraphs, and almost entirely matter-of-fact, which somehow made it harder to get through. Her father wrote that Cole Merritt had not caused the cascade failure. Cole had identified a critical design flaw in the transfer protocol 3 days before the failure event, and had spent those 3 days building a manual bypass routing with his own hands, working without sleep, which was the only reason the failure had affected 2 neighborhoods instead of 6 counties. Patrick had allowed Caro to redirect the official investigation because Caro had told him that the true cause, a series of below-specification components sourced through a vendor with direct family ties to Caro's brother-in-law, would expose the company to liability large enough to end it. Patrick had agreed. He had been afraid, and he had been wrong, and he had spent the years following, telling himself that the settlement payment and the non-disclosure agreement had somehow made it even. Near the end of the letter, one sentence made Diana set the page down and look at the ceiling for a long time. Neil isn't hiding the past anymore. He's running the same contract scheme right now, and someone is going to get hurt. Cole found the tampered seal on the primary transfer bus housing on the 21st night. Someone had cut the factory security seal and replaced it with a counterfeit. The internal routing had been altered, not broken, not malfunctioning, but deliberately adjusted so that a specific sequence of load conditions would cause the bus to fail in a way that would register in the logs as ordinary equipment aging rather than targeted interference. He checked the maintenance calendar and understood immediately what he was looking at. The failure had been engineered to occur during the board's planned vote on a major pending acquisition, one that Caro had been pushing for since the previous quarter. A timed power disruption at precisely the right moment would sever the building's connection to the audit documentation servers, corrupting the independent financial review that Diana had quietly commissioned 3 weeks earlier without notifying the full board. Cole sat with this for a long time in the stillness of the mechanical room, with the hum of the building around him and the weight of a choice he had not expected to face again. He could say nothing, keep his head down, finish his trial, keep his job, pick up Jake from school each afternoon, and let someone else carry whatever came next. He chose instead to call Joanne Polk. He called her because she had never once treated him as less than competent, and because every technical observation he had made in 3 weeks had turned out to be accurate, and because he had learned at considerable cost that a man acting alone against an institution with unlimited resources rarely survives the fight in any form that matters. Joanne believed him. She had spent 16 years watching the building run, and she knew what normal looked like. What Cole was describing was not normal. She quietly allowed him to document the equipment within the scope of his assigned duties, and she kept her own parallel record without telling him she was doing it. Over the following week, Cole cross-referenced maintenance invoices against the physical serial numbers stamped on the equipment in the lower mechanical levels. He found that nearly a third of the components billed as new replacements were refurbished units, sold at premium prices, installed under premium paperwork, registered through a vendor entity that traced back, through 2 holding companies, to a firm in which Caro's brother-in-law held a majority stake. He organized his findings the way he had once organized emergency response plans, labeled by date, location, and the name of the technician who had signed off on each installation. It was slow work, done after midnight with a flashlight and a legal pad, and none of it would have mattered without someone at the top willing to look at it without flinching. The board convened on a Tuesday morning in the 31st floor conference suite. Caro arrived early and positioned himself at the center of the table, the acquisition approval documents already laid out in front of him. He had been pushing Diana toward a same-day signature for weeks, citing market timing and competitive risk with the consistency of someone who had a reason beyond either of those things to want the deal closed quickly. When his assistant messaged him at 9:47 that an independent auditor had been spotted on the 28th floor, Caro excused himself from the pre-meeting conversation and stepped into the corridor. He made 3 calls in 6 minutes. At 10:22, Sandra Hatch appeared on the maintenance level with 2 members of building security and announced, in front of 4 of Cole's colleagues, that his access badge had been flagged for an unauthorized entry into a restricted server corridor the previous evening. She confiscated his badge and informed him that he would need to vacate the premises while the matter was reviewed. Cole asked, without raising his voice, whether she could specify which corridor and at what time, since his shift log would show his location for every minute of his last 6 shifts. Sandra told him the details would be handled through HR. Cole noticed that Neil Caro had appeared at the far end of the hallway before any formal incident report had been submitted to anyone, and he said so, calmly and clearly in front of everyone present. For a single moment, something moved behind Caro's expression that was not quite composed. Joanne Polk arrived with a printed copy of the shift assignment log. Cole had been dispatched to address a reported coolant pressure irregularity in precisely the location where the unauthorized entry was alleged to have occurred. She had signed the assignment herself. The timestamp matched. There was no violation. Diana reversed the termination order within the hour and called a formal hearing. The boardroom was full when the proceedings began. Directors, outside counsel, 2 bank representatives connected by video, and Elias Rowe, the independent auditor, seated near the wall with a laptop and a portable drive. Cole sat at the far end of the table in his work uniform because his shift had ended 40 minutes before the meeting started and there had been no time to change. Caro used the uniform deliberately. He presented a reconstructed copy of the original Cascade Failure Investigation Summary and walked the board through Cole's alleged protocol deviations with the fluency of someone who had told the same story so many times it had become smooth in all the right places. He asked the board directly whether they would trust the judgment of a man who now maintained their building's mechanical systems over the woman whose family had built the company over 30 years. A few board members shifted in their seats with expressions that Cole recognized from the last time he had sat in a room like this one. He did not try to win them over with emotion. He asked to examine the summary document, and within 2 minutes pointed out that the date format in the header did not match the internal file dating convention Halverson used during that fiscal period, and that the digital certification stamp embedded in the metadata had been applied nearly 2 years after the incident date the document claimed to record. Caro said he was speculating without proof. Diana placed her father's letter on the table. Caro dismissed it as a private communication with no evidentiary standing. Elias Rowe stood up. He walked the board through 17 vendor invoices in 15 minutes, each one carrying small discrepancies that were individually easy to overlook and collectively impossible to explain. Billing codes that did not match the installed components, installation dates that preceded their own purchase orders, certification stamps from inspection facilities that had closed before the equipment was supposedly reviewed. The financial trail ran from Halverson's maintenance budget through 2 holding companies into an entity, registered under the name of Caro's brother-in-law. Several board members who had personally approved those budget line items were very still. Caro pivoted without hesitation and accused Cole of having conspired with Diana to manufacture the audit trail specifically to block the acquisition. A deal, he said, that Diana had opposed for personal rather than professional reasons from the beginning. Cole asked to pull the building system's display onto the main screen. He explained in plain language, without technical jargon, exactly how the switching stations had been adjusted to produce timed failures, substantial enough to suppress the stock valuation ahead of merger price negotiations, modest enough to read as ordinary infrastructure deterioration in the maintenance logs. Caro told him he was the same overconfident engineer who had cost this company millions the first time, now wearing a different uniform and telling the same story. A younger board member asked Cole, carefully, how he could describe technical specifics from an event a decade ago with such precision, given that he had no documentation of his own to reference. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said that a man does not forget. The night he spent rebuilding a transfer routing, by hand, to keep the lights on for 300,000 people. And that some things stay with a person because of what it costs to do them, not because of what anyone ever wrote down afterward. The room was quieter after that than it had been at any point in the previous 2 hours. Joanne Polk came through the side door carrying a flat storage box she had recovered that morning from behind a false panel in a basement filing room, a room that had been marked for decommissioning for years and never actually cleared. Inside were the original incident records from the Cascade event, Cole's hand-drawn emergency bypass schematics, the real-time system logs from the night of the failure, and a signed agreement on Halverson Company letterhead dated 11 years earlier, in which Patrick Forsyth had committed to granting Cole a licensing stake in the emergency load transfer protocol Cole had designed during the crisis. The agreement had a name typed at the bottom of the page. The Merritt Protocol Agreement. The licensing stake was not large enough to give Cole control of anything, but it carried formal rights over any sale or acquisition involving the grid protection systems the protocol underpinned, systems that had been quietly running and protecting Halverson's infrastructure for 11 years, without Cole's name attached to any of them. Caro had suppressed the agreement because the current acquisition could not legally close if Cole Merritt's rights under it were ever formally recognized. Caro tried one final position, claiming that Cole had signed away all future claims as part of his separation settlement a decade earlier. Cole explained what had actually been placed in front of him on that last day: his final paycheck in one envelope, a non-disclosure agreement in another, and a verbal statement from a company attorney that every member of his engineering team would lose their positions if he did not sign before end of business. He had signed. He had not spoken publicly. For 11 years, 300 people had kept their jobs, while Cole Merritt had lost everything, except the discipline not to make their livelihoods someone else's problem. Elias Rowe confirmed that the value of the licensing stake named in the Merritt Protocol Agreement had grown substantially over the intervening years, not because anyone had managed it with care, but because the system Cole had built under pressure had simply continued working, quietly and without recognition, protecting the company from failures that no one else had ever fully understood. Diana asked Patrick's former chief legal officer, present as a silent witness at her request, why the Merritt Protocol Agreement had never been formally registered. The man admitted, under the weight of the room, that Neil Caro had instructed him to archive the document rather than record it, and that he had followed that instruction without asking why. At 10:41, every grid monitor in the building began cycling amber. Cole was already watching the main system's display when the first alarm activated, and he understood in the same moment that the cascade had been pre-programmed to trigger during the hearing, timed to sever the building's connection to the audit documentation servers and give Caro grounds to challenge the integrity of everything Elias Rowe had presented. Cole stood. He told the room, in a level voice, that the primary and secondary switching stations were entering a simultaneous overload sequence, and that if nothing was done in the next 6 minutes, the building would lose backup power, the audit server connection would drop, and the event logs recording the access commands used to initiate the failure would be automatically purged under the standard hardware emergency protocol. Caro called it theater, a manufactured distraction timed to delay the vote. Diana looked at Cole for one moment. "Go," she said. Cole did not rush. He assigned Joanne to relay status updates from the mechanical level by radio, directed 2 facilities technicians to isolate the secondary station's manual bypass, and told Elias Rowe to begin mirroring the audit data to the portable drive immediately and without stopping regardless of what happened on the network. In the mechanical room 4 floors below, Cole found that the primary transfer bus had already been locked into a failure sequence through a software override initiated from a senior executive access account. He did not spend time being surprised by whose credentials had been used. He worked through the secondary bypass manually, guided a junior technician through the junction box sequence, step by step without raising his voice, and then activated the tertiary redundancy routing that he had designed 12 years ago and that no one had ever removed from the system because no one had understood it well enough to know it was there. The lights across the building flickered once. Then they held. The audit server connection remained active. The event logs remained intact. The access records showed, in complete and unambiguous detail, that the override initiating the failure sequence had been authorized through Neil Caro's executive credentials at 9:53 that morning. When Cole returned to the boardroom, not a single person in the room was looking at his uniform. Caro said he had simply gotten lucky. Diana picked up the original employee access badge that had been inside her father's locked drawer, the badge bearing the name Cole Merritt, issued 11 years ago, and set it beside the Merritt Protocol Agreement on the table. She addressed the board directly. "He just saved this building for the second time," she said, and the same man had spent a decade convincing everyone he was the reason it needed saving the first time. The board accepted every condition without formal objection. Neil Caro was escorted from the building by internal security, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the particular kind of quiet that settles over a room when people who were once afraid of someone realize all at once that they no longer are. As he passed Cole in the corridor, he said Cole had still walked into this building asking to mop floors. Cole said that was true, and that it was exactly what had let him see what the people on the upper floors had stopped looking at a long time ago. Sandra Hatch was suspended pending the conduct review. Cole did not ask for more than that, and he did not speak in her defense either, letting the weight of her choices settle where it belonged. Diana offered Cole a newly created position, Director of Grid Safety and Infrastructure Integrity. She told him the role had been built around what he had proven he could do, which was more than she could say for most of the titles currently represented on the 31st floor. Cole's first request was that Joanne Polk be appointed to the company's newly formed Operational Standards Committee. He told Diana that Joanne understood the people who kept the building running better than anyone who had ever worked in the floors above them, and that any reform worth making should begin with someone who had been paying clear attention for 16 years. Diana agreed without hesitation. Cole accepted the position on the condition that he be allowed to finish the maintenance shift he had already clocked in for that evening. Diana found him later in the main lobby, mopping the same floor where Sandra Hatch had watched him collect his papers off the tile on the first morning, and asked him why, given everything, he was still doing it. Cole wrung out the mop and looked up at her. "A job doesn't become beneath a person," he said, "just because powerful people wouldn't do it themselves." Diana bent down and picked up a paper cup someone had left near the reception desk and dropped it in the bin. It was a small gesture, but it was the first sign that she intended to change something real about the company she had inherited, and not merely how it looked from the outside. Jake Merritt learned the full shape of his father's story on a Saturday afternoon several months later, at a small ceremony in the Halverson main lobby, honoring the facilities and maintenance team for their contribution to the building's infrastructure safety record. He sat in the front row beside Joanne Polk, who had been introduced to him as the person who believed his father first, before anyone else had reason to, and he watched Cole stand at a plain wooden podium that was nothing like a boardroom stage, and he began to understand, for the first time, Why his father had always come home from the night shift looking, despite everything, like a man who had done exactly what he set out to do. Cole kept his remarks brief. He thanked Joanne by name and 4 other maintenance technicians whose names had never appeared in any company announcement before that afternoon, and he asked that their names be printed in the official program instead of his photograph on the cover. The request was granted without argument. The lobby, where no one had once bothered to look at him, now had a small framed notice near the reception desk, added at Cole's request, listing the facilities and maintenance team by name as recognized contributors to the building's operational safety record. Above the main entrance, the company's stated values had been quietly updated, at Diana's direction, to include one new line written in plain language at Cole's suggestion. Every person in this building deserves to be seen. The night shift team used the front entrance now, the same doors the executives used, and nobody from building management said a word about it, and no one ever would again.